Thank you for joining and welcome to Lead Dev Bookmarked.
Thanks for having
Lead,
me.
yeah, I'm so excited to have you here. I loved your book. Lead Dev is a global community of engineering leaders who come together to discuss all things leadership, teams, tool, and tech. Bookmarked is our monthly book club, and this is our 11th event. I always say this and I'm like, oh my gosh, how has it been 11? It's so exciting. Make sure to join the Lead Dev Slack workspace. We'll take some questions live here with Maude, and then we'll continue the discussion there afterwards. You can find details at leaddev.com/bookmarked. I'm Susan Bond, and I'll be your moderator for this discussion. I'm a former COO of a scaling startup and an executive coach. My specialty is tech leaders. You can find me on Twitter at Susan Bond. Today we'll be talking about refactoring at scale with Maude Lemaire. I don't even know how to say it.
Yeah,
Is it
that's good.
Lemaire?
Yeah, I mean, if you want to say it the real French way, it's Maude Lemaire, but
Oh, Maude Lemaire.
yeah.
All right, there we go.
Well
Maude
done.
Lemaire is a software engineer at Slack, where she works to scale the product to support some of the world's largest organizations. She spends most of her time chasing down people, making network calls in a loop, refactoring unwieldy chunks of code, and building tools for other developers. Maude cares deeply about the developer experience and has actively sought out simpler, more effective ways to structure code in each of her roles at all levels of the stack. So excited to have you here.
Thanks for having me.
So, how did refactoring at scale come about? Like, was there a moment you realized that a change in approach was needed? Like, how did this all come about?
Um, it sort of surprised me. So I always really liked conference talks that told stories of big sort of scary projects from start to finish, or the kinds that, went into like, oh, we had this massive incident and like this is all the stuff that happened and the like nitty-gritty technical details, and then we remembered this, and all these like story type conference talks were always sort of my favorite. And I was just coming out of having finished the refactor. That's actually one of the case studies in the book. So the first one, chapter 11. And I thought this was a cool project. Like there's a bunch of like fun, random technical details. And it was, and people are always sort of intrigued by finding out what makes Slack work behind the scenes. And so I'll submit a conference talk about this project I did. And that's what it was. It was a story, it went through all the stages and all the technical details. And I presented it at an O'Reilly conference in New York at VelocityConf in 2018. And then basically the same talk at Lead Dev in Austin a couple months later. And maybe like 10 or so months later, O'Reilly wrote back to me and they said, would you like to maybe write a book proposal to like extend on the stuff from your conference talk? And I thought that was really interesting because I was remembering back to the talk, and what I thought was going to resonate with folks was all the like sort of nitty-gritty technical details of like this weird stuff that we had to deal with. But what people were like really, really resonating with was everything that went around it. So the planning piece and the like convincing people to help me piece. And it got like a really, really great reception that I was not expecting from that side. And so when they wrote to me, I was like, okay, like I can write a book proposal. That's like low commitment. Like that doesn't mean I have to write a book. I can spend a weekend doing that. Cool. So I did a bunch of research and I wrote this book proposal and I submitted it. And then they were like, oh, so would you like to write this book now? And I was like, oh, I guess that is the next logical step of writing a book proposal is they ask you to write the book. And I was like, that's a big commitment. What do I do? I eventually decided to plot twist, write the book. But it was, when I was writing the overall structure for it, the outline with all the chapters, and it changed quite a bit during the writing process. Most of the chapters stayed the same, but some of them, got ripped out and some got replaced with others. And thankfully they were pretty flexible with me changing my mind partway through. But a lot of it was this, the stuff that happens outside the code. And I think that was where like, it was clear that people resonated with that, and it was clear that I needed to address that.
Yeah, it struck me, how it was really quite different. The approach that you take in this book, I think, is really quite different. And so that's what we'll talk a lot about today for anyone who hasn't read the book, sort of the stuff that's around all of the code, and all those things that we maybe don't think about. So I'm really curious about how do folks, just to get us started, how do folks determine when it's time to refactor?
Yeah, that's a tough one. And I think it's a different threshold for everyone. And so that's why, like a sort of catch-all answer doesn't really exist there. But in a very generic sense, prioritization is what it comes down to of, if you stack rank all of the projects that you need to be working on that, maybe like comes from your product manager or comes from your manager or comes from, whoever else in the org that you didn't really decide to do, but you need to do in your quarter, in your year. And then you map those to everyone sort of has this like backlog in their head of like, oh, I'd like to do this and I'd like to clean this. And kind of like house maintenance, you're like, oh, I need to like repaint the shed. I need to do all these things.
Like, ooh, that box in the corner that needs to be sorted out.
Yeah, I moved 5 years ago and I haven't unpacked that box. Like I probably should do that. Those sorts of tasks. Everyone has this backlog in their head. Sometimes it's a really good exercise actually to write it down. And also everyone else has a different backlog. And so if you talk to different people on your team, they also have this like running list. And it's really interesting to like cross-reference. Do you both have like maybe the top 10 are the same? You're like, oh, this is interesting. This means that it's a problem for you too. And then you start talking to other people on your team. Maybe you think this problem is impacting others on another team. You talk to them, see how top of mind it is for them. And then that gives you a sense of priority. And then basically you just stack rank everything in terms of priority. And you determine like, okay, this project really needs to get done, but like, will it get done faster if we fix this thing that everyone wants to fix? So it's a constant sort of recalibration of these priorities. And one thing that I try to live by, but sometimes I fail to, that one of my favorite engineers at work, lives by religiously every day is he wakes up and he says, okay, what is the most impactful thing I can be doing today? Sometimes the answer to that is like address that really bad piece of code or like make a case for, in this case, like a much bigger refactor of this thing because you think it'll actually make an impact.
Yeah, I love that because it speaks to like collaboration and working together as a team rather than maybe being a single effort. Because it reminds me of like, well, when should they not refactor? You have some really great examples in the book.
Yeah. I mean, there's a lot of reasons not to refactor, which I think is why, I mean, I love spending my time doing it. I think a lot of engineers love spending their time doing it, but realistically, like if you're trying to answer that question of like, what is the most impactful thing I can be doing today? Most of the time, it's not going to be like addressing this one refactoring bit. And that's okay. Like that's like, we work for businesses and like, we have to figure out how to keep the product moving. And that's just how it works. So it's okay if you come up with something and like, you're like, this is just not the time. Like you have no time. You look at the time that you have allotted to work on all these things and there's just no time. If you don't have the time, you can't start doing it because a half done refactor is a million times worse than no refactor at all.
It's like you pulled out the junk drawer and then now the junk drawer is everywhere.
Yes. Yeah. You started organizing it and you dumped it all on your kitchen counter, but like you only put half of it back in and now like you have no kitchen counter because it's
you can't like make the coffee, make breakfast. You're like moving 10 things. Yeah.
And I think one of the examples I talk about in the book that is a little bit controversial, maybe controversial is the wrong word for it, but it's this concept of if you happen to be passing by. There's a lot of people who will say, always leave, abide by the like nice campground rule, like always leave the campground cleaner than you found it. And yes, that is a nice way to go about like tidying things and making things sure are progressively better over time. But that really only works for really tiny changes that are really incremental. And like, again, do you have time to make them? But also really only work if it's code that your team owns and that like you won't be on the hook for writing someone else's code and then like shipping it and rewriting it and being like, oh, whoops, like they come up later and realize that you rewrote their code. That's a surprise to everyone. That's not great. Like it actually happened to me in a previous job where I wrote a bunch of code for this feature, and I had a couple of people on my team review it and my manager review it and, shipped it. And then I went on PTO for a week, and then I came back and I looked at it and it was completely different. And of course you like go through the Git blame journey of finding out what the heck happened to this code you wrote. And turns out my manager had rewritten all of it.
Because they happened to be passing by, or because?
Yep.
Yeah.
Because he wanted to make it do this one thing in this other part of the code, and he had to like go through my code to get there. And so he thought, oh, I'm here. Like while I'm here, I'll just, change these things a little bit, make it more the way that I want it to be. And, it'll be fine. It's not a big deal. Thankfully, like, there were no incidents that were caused by this, and it was still within the realm of our team. But like, I've heard stories of engineers going through and like, because of the way that like our code can get really sprawly, they just like clean things up along the way, like 20 steps away. And then an incident happens and it's in code that was rewritten by an engineer who has nothing to do with that team. And that team is on the hook for fixing it. And they're like, what the heck happened? And someone else approved the code. You're just like eroding trust left and right.
Right. It sounds like you're causing problems that that are more organizational, and then also eroding trust. Like, I just have to ask, like, did you have a conversation with your manager about what they did? Or was it like hard to have a conversation about like, hey, you know what I mean?
It was also like, I think I was 3 months out of school at that point. So,
oh gosh. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So you're like, oh, okay.
Yeah, but I did tell him like, hey, this like really didn't feel great. And I feel like if you'd had a lot of concerns, I would have loved to hear them during like code review. Like code review is a great time for this. And he just, the happen to be passing by thing is just, you're not really thinking about it. You're just thinking about the code, and you're not thinking about this entire like organizational structure that exists around the code, which is like the original author who might stand to learn something from your opinion on something, on how to restructure this so that it works better. And also like it comes down to a lot of subjectivity. Like, yes, there are some things that are objectively better in how you can write code one way or the other. It just makes it more performant or more resilient or whatever it is. But a lot of it is entirely subjective. And I find that a lot of the times that especially really senior engineers end up doing this whole like passing by refactor thing, it's mostly from a subjective perspective of like, I personally think that it is better if I do it this way. And it comes from like many years of experience, and in a lot of ways, maybe it is objectively better, but you're missing out on the opportunity to teach that original author something, have a conversation. You're missing out on an opportunity to maybe mentor them if they like need that mentorship. Trust, like you're suddenly creating not an enemy, but almost like internally within your organization. Like that's not great.
Yeah, that example really stuck out to me, that I thought, wow, I bet so many people, this has happened so many times. And like you said, it's not out of malice. I think people really are trying to make it better, and we don't recognize like maybe how we might be impacting negatively other people or the organization. Yeah, that really stuck out to me. So it's a great example, everybody, if you want to read in the book. So let's talk a little bit more about, you talk about like quantifying the current state before jumping into refactoring, which I thought was just brilliant. So, the idea of like planning it, which is the opposite of just happened by, and obviously that's likely more of a smaller refactor. And maybe if you're going to, do planning, it's more of a larger scale. But what should folks consider in the planning phase?
There's a lot of things to consider. I think a lot of it ties back to the prioritization stuff that I was talking about earlier of it's okay at any point when you're doing this sort of like prospective look at a potential large refactor to like say at any point, like, actually, I don't think this is worth it. Like, it's okay to change your mind partway through. Like, it's gathering data, right? You're gathering all these different points of data, and it's okay to change your mind and be like, okay, not worth it this time around. Maybe we'll look at it another quarter. But the gathering data phase is really important because it sets you up for just setting up expectations with everyone. With yourself, with anyone else who's going to work with you, with your manager, if you're going to try to sell it to your manager, if you're going to try to sell it to literally anyone else at the company. And it also helps you make sure that you're not solving the wrong problem, which sometimes we do. I've definitely been guilty of this. I've been like, oh, I'm going to solve, like, this is a problem. This code just like doesn't make sense. Like, I'm going to make it better. And I didn't really think about what better meant. And so I set off in one direction, and then I like fixed it, and then really like I just kind of ignored like what the real problem was that was going on. And so that's where like you have to figure out what is the best way to characterize the problem so that you're like really honing down on what the problem itself is. Then you focus on fixing that, and then it actually makes making a plan a lot easier. So with the really, really big refactors, there's like about 20 million different steps, and you have to figure out how to like make those steps reversible so that you're never stuck in this phase where you like absolutely need to be moving forward, otherwise everything's going to break, or you like you can't step back, right? These have to be reversible, especially if you're doing it like in live production systems, like while customers are actively using your product. Like, please make every step reversible, please and thank you. You will thank yourself. Like,
my heart is like this when you say that. I'm like, oh.
You absolutely need to do it. There's like, just do not cut around that. There's no excuse. And by making sure that you're really fixing only the right problem, like you can scope down your plan and you can make it only the things that you need to fix. It also helps you figure out where along the way you can just comfortably stop. And so one of the things that I really recommend when you're making this like big, broad plan for a refactor is identify milestones where reaching them on their own is like a win in itself. Like, and you can comfortably maybe stop there. It's sort of like, I compare it to a road trip in the book. Like, you're driving from Montreal to Vancouver in the book. Sure, you could do the cross-country drive and like not really think about where to stop along the way, but like, that's not interesting. It's also sort of demoralizing to just like drive through the prairies without stopping. So maybe find some place to stop that is like innately meaningful along the way. Maybe you've never seen Calgary before. I don't know, stop in Calgary or something. But the idea is that if for some reason priorities change while you're executing on this really big refactor, you are able to make that sort of decision at partway through the project of like, okay, like priorities have changed. Like, actually, like we need to completely pivot where the product is going for some reason. We've reached this critical point in the refactor. That's fine. Let's just leave it there, hold it there for now, and we can come back to it later if we need to. It'll just make sure that like everyone feels like they've achieved a sense of, everyone like gets that sense of achievement of like, I've reached this point. That feels great. It's not quite complete, but like, hey, I've gotten to Calgary. Okay, great. And it's an important point along the way where you can, make that decision to stop if you need to.
Well, yeah, and it talks to me a little bit about, sorry to interrupt, the value, making sure you're having value and impact, because there's lots of things that are probably, you're like, oh, that is, I don't want to look at that, like, oh, but does it really impact the way that the code functions? And is it the biggest priority in terms of, so that your system continue running and extending itself as you go forward, right?
Yeah. And to go back to like specific ways of quantifying, I think a lot of ways that we, or at least I have a computer science degree. And so a lot of folks who have computer science degrees are like taught like, oh, these are Halstead metrics. This is how you measure the complexity of code. And there is value in these measurements in a lot of cases. And, academics came up with them for a reason, but there's a lot more, I think, interesting and unintuitive ways to measure the degradation of code in a way, or to measure the problems with your code that don't really come to people that way as like as academically trained programmers, it doesn't, you don't come up with these things. So a lot of ways that I think it's really interesting to look at code is just look at the documentation around it. Like if there's no documentation or the documentation constantly changes, or my favorite, in the documentation, there's a line that says something along the lines of, this is constantly changing, like we don't have documentation for this thing for a reason. Or, you have a tech spec. This I've run into a couple number of times, which is really interesting. You sort of reach this point with this certain service or this certain piece of code where you're like, it just doesn't extend itself the way that I would like it to. Like every time I want to extend it to do this thing, it's just like, really painful exercise. Like I wonder what people thought, what were the original assumptions when the tech spec for this thing was written? And that is just like a journey in itself. When you find that original document, hopefully you find it, hopefully it exists. When you find that original tech spec, usually, or at least the way that we write our tech specs at Slack, there's always a section on alternative approaches not chosen. And that's where folks go into like, we could have designed it this way, but it didn't solve for X requirements. Or we could have solved it this way, but it would have taken like 10 more years to implement. I'm exaggerating a bit, but several more years, and it would have been a huge pain in the butt. And we don't have enough people to do that right now. So we went with this option. It is pragmatic. It works. And so you can take a look at how it currently lives, take a look at that tech spec, look at how different those requirements are, look at how different the assumptions are, the reality of the world you live in now, and the assumptions that were made when the tech spec was written. And once you have that mismatch, you have a really, really great, like a perfectly good example. It's not a number, right? It's not like a quantifiable value, but you have a really great example of this thing clearly changed. Like the assumptions around it clearly changed. And therefore, like this option that we didn't choose because it took 10 more engineers and would have taken 3 more months to implement, now that's a viable option.
Because the code base is dynamic. It's a constantly changing. I always think about it as like organizations, which is my specialty. Organizations are dynamic. They're constantly changing, and a code base is the same way.
100%.
So there's something that you talked about here. Like, let's say, in the book that I really loved. So let's say you're an engineer and you are working in the code base, and a lot of you are like, this code base needs to be refactoring. But let's say your boss is kind of reluctant to go along, with the plan, but you got to get them on board. And so, you offer some really great tips, like the alignment sandwich, which I personally love. Everybody's got to read about that one, which is different than the crap sandwich. I will put it that way in management. But like rallying the team and talking to their skip level, or logical arguments through evidence, or even playing hardball, stopping maintaining work / invisible work, or even making an ultimatum. How do you know which method is best to use to approach your boss to get them on board? Where do you start?
You start from the least explosive option and you work your way down.
No, I'm doing a sit-in and I'm not eating right, like I'm not working. Yeah,
that really want to go I'm going to quit my job if you do not let me refactor this code. Like that's not going to go over well.
Right.
It's not going to work. That's probably not going to work unless you're like a principal engineer and I mean,
we laugh about it, but it's true, because I actually see a lot, even as a coach, I see a lot of people actually get into control battles with their boss. And I hear about that. I'm like, oh, that's not going to go well for you. I feel bad. I'm like, oh, that's tough. I see your point, but boy, that's rough. Power dynamics are real.
Yeah. And I think it goes back to the trust, right? Like you have to work on a basis of trust. If you do not have an established trust level, I said established twice. If you do not have established trust level, it's not going to work. And actually that's why, even before any of this, I recommend whatever your level. I don't care if you're 3 months out of school or you're 10 years out of school or you're about to retire. If you are not having regular conversations, and these don't have to be every week, right? I'm talking max once a month. If you don't have regular conversations with your skip level, do those now. Start now.
Build those relationships in advance of when you need them.
Yes, well in advance of when you need them, because they will come in very, very handy down the line. And it also, like, for more junior folks, like, it'll open you up to all sorts of career opportunities that you might not have had. Even if you have the best manager in the world, there's something else that comes from talking to your skip level and asking them. There's like a really simple question that I recommend asking both your manager and your skip level, which is, what are you most worried about in the next 6 months? And what are you most worried about in the next year? And
yeah. So good. I'm like, that is so good. Like, that's such a, I'm like, oh yeah, write that one down. So it seems obvious, but I'm like, oh yeah, that's really good.
Yeah.
Push it down, like giving them those 2 periods of time and being really specific. Mm-hmm.
Because, you know, the next quarter, you've already planned for the next quarter. So that is not really like a useful question to be asking. Like, your team probably, or your organizational structure probably has some sort of list somewhere of your like quarterly goals. Cool. 6 months. And even though your company might have like yearly goals, honestly, like, as much as we try to plan for things, like no one planned for COVID, right? And so, like, sort of everyone's business plans got sort of thrown out the window when COVID hit. Like, priorities changed dramatically all the time. And so even though you have this like global plan, like quarterly plans, okay, those don't change quite as much, but 6 months is like a really good intermediate time period where some things might have changed in the meantime. And then years, like that answer probably will change very frequently as you ask them throughout the year. And so that's a really interesting one. And by asking them these questions, like you're sort of seeking ways that you can help them. And that's how you can sell whatever big refactor you think you need to be doing. Like, find a way that this refactor fixes their problem. Mm-hmm. And if it doesn't, that's fine. Maybe also that's an indication that it's not the most impactful thing you can be doing. And maybe it's a different refactor that will help address those big problems. Because most of the time, or at least the people that I've worked with in my management change, have been incredibly competent. And usually what they're worried about a year out, I'm like, oh, that's a really good one. And then you figure out a way to tie what you want to work on to these broader goals. Yeah, it takes some creative thinking sometimes, but that's where also, like, work with your team. If you're all in agreement that this is a really big problem that you need to solve, then that creates pressure also not only to your manager, but to your like organization as a whole, depending on like how big this mass of engineers is that you're all in agreement with. But they're also able to help you like sell that point really creatively. You can all work together to convince your manager, or you can work together to convince your skip if your manager really doesn't want to hear it. And one of the reasons that managers are held to like completely different standards than engineers are in most companies. Like, if you look at what's really interesting, which I did a couple of years ago, and I was like, oh, we came out with a new management career ladder at Slack, and I was like, I wonder how different this is from the engineering ladder. It's so different. The answer is like dramatically different. They are rated on completely different axes. And so like your priorities don't, like, yes, they align, but like sometimes not really. And if you work on a product engineering team, like your manager is responsible for like ensuring that your team is very effective and shipping lots of product features. Like, that's how it works. And so like if refactoring is going to like get in the way of shipping product features in the immediate, like it might help in the long run, but that's really tough for certain managers to see. Not all of them, obviously. Some managers are really great and are able to see that sort of like exponential ability to reap rewards on refactors, but like not everyone. And so be in that mindset of like, take what they're being rated on and then, you know, figure out how that works. But if you can work with your skip level and then you can work with your engineers and you can convince your skip level that it's worth it and you can convince everyone on your team that it's worth it, that's how you create the alignment sandwich. And it sort of forces your manager to become aligned with both groups.
Well, yeah. And if you're already asking all of these important questions and understanding, then that kind of works all in concert. I recently did a survey of leaders and I talked about like what surprised you about leadership. And one of the things that really stood out, someone said, at how different leaders think, and like the kinds
Yeah.
of things that are on their plates. And I think there's a lot of times where like they just don't get it, when in fact they are thinking about something different. And that lack of alignment, I think obviously managers are responsible for it, but so are we, to bring up those issues from the ground up that we are seeing that they just can't see because they don't live in the code. Most of them, depending on,
Yeah.
but most don't live in the code base every day, so it's like we got to do our part together, right, to work with them. Yeah, I love this. Okay, I can go at that a long time. Let me ask a couple more questions. We're going to go a little bit longer here. So let's say you finally got the green light. You got your manager on board. That alignment sandwich worked like a charm, and you've got this large scale refactoring planned. And I'm curious, like, obviously going it alone, you're not doing it alone. You're going to need a team. You're going to need a bigger boat. And so, can you use the existing team, or if not, how do you form the team for this refactoring?
Yeah, that's that's one that I think a lot of people don't, sort of people by default assume that like it has to be their team. Because ideally you're planning a refactor for something that impacts you and your team. Ideally you're not doing something that doesn't impact you at all. If it impacts you, maybe also it impacts other teams. And that's where you get into like the really, really big refactors that affect like everyone using the entire code base, and those get really intense. And those are basically the ones that somehow I always end up doing, but
and we are benefiting from your knowledge because of that. Yeah. So thank you.
You're welcome, I guess. I don't know how I end up in this situation. I mean, I enjoy it. That's probably why. But ideally, you're doing something that somehow impacts you in some way and others. If it impacts just your team, then yeah, okay, your team is probably the best people to help you in addressing that and getting that refactor through. But if you're doing something that affects way more than your team, say like your entire backend team, then you might want to pull representatives from every product team or every product pillar, if you have pillars or whatever your vertical structure is, so that you get different representatives from different parts of the code base who have different expertises in each of the different product features. Because you in your own little bubble and your team who all work, say like on the user service, and you do everything that has to do with users, might not know anything about, let's say we're using Twitter as an example, like the tweet service next door. And if you're doing something that impacts both of them, like you need someone who knows how the tweets are stored in the database to help you, because you might ship a bug. You might not think something through some random edge case. You need those different perspectives to make sure that you're doing really the best job you can be doing and impacting the fewest people as possible, as little negative impact as possible to everyone who's being impacted. And so that's where, yeah, sometimes you form like teams that are, their explicit purpose is to do a refactor, especially if you've been able to sell this like high enough, say like your director or your VP level, then they have the power to pull all these people from all these different groups and like sort of create maybe a tiger team, which is like a team of just experts like coming together for this one initiative, and then they'll be like disbanded and everyone will go back to their teams at the end just to do that refactor. But it's important to gather all the resources that you need in terms of people. And it's tough also to come up with like, what's the right number of people for a project? Yeah, that really depends on like what resources you can get. If you can get fewer resources, then maybe try to aim for more senior people who are able to maybe churn out a bit more code a little bit faster than more junior people. But you also really want to balance. You don't want a refactor tiger team that's only principal engineers. Like that's not a great, like, yes, you'll get it done. You'll get it done in one way. But there's like really important value that junior engineers and perspective that they bring to these types of projects. I've seen projects where they tried to completely shift the paradigm of a code base, say from like, I don't know, something, you're going to OO for some reason, I don't know. And you're not really thinking through how the adoption is going to work for everyone else. and you're not seeing how easy it is to understand these new patterns that you're introducing in the rest of the code base. And that can be really tough. And when your customers are other engineers who work with you, like you need to talk to your customers. It's just like PMs do, going out and talking to customers and figuring out like, what's the next feature we need to build? It's the same exact mindset that you need to be taking into these really big refactors, because the reason you're doing this is to help everyone on the engineering team do a better job. So you need to keep that in mind.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot to in here about communication, and I'm just gonna ask a couple more questions here, and then Maude will join us over on Slack, of course. So one question is like, let's say you've made it successfully through, your refactoring project. What's the most important thing that you can do to make sure the team adopts good practice so the change lasts? Or so you have maybe you say like the impact that you want, because obviously code is always changing. There's going to be another refactoring coming along at some point.
Yeah.
Or a change.
Oh yeah. Yeah. Product's going to decide that suddenly you're switching completely directions and it needs to change again. Yeah. There's a lot of different ways. I think it also ties back into, you need to know who your customers are, and you need to really talk to them and understand what their concerns are and how to best ease their transition once the refactor is done. The best refactors are ones that are completely invisible, not only to the users of your product, right? Because that's sort of the whole point of a refactor, is everything before is the same after, is also making it as invisible as possible to all the other engineers. And so if you make sure that like you have really solid adoption patterns, but also they're really, really lightweight, like you basically did not change the entire process with which everyone goes about cutting a new pull request, like putting out new code, testing something, then like you're doing your job really well. It's like the stream is not going to go up the hill. It's always going to go down the hill. And so everything you can do to make your stream go downhill is going to help with the adoption. Write really great documentation. Like that helps so much. Make sure that you're factoring in time into your plan for the adoption piece once you're done. When you're done, like once you've written that last piece of code and like everything is refactored, you're not done. Surprise, you have all this adoption to do to make sure that everyone is moving forward and doing things in the new way as you intended it to. And sometimes like that actually involves rewriting some stuff that you wrote that you thought was done because it's confusing, or the refactor didn't quite address this one piece of the problem that like a bunch of engineers on this other team like actually thought was a really critical issue. And so like you're not really done until all of these things, this adoption piece is really figured out. There's also a lot of ways that you can like make the adoption really easy and sort of like build it into your CI, make some linting rules and prevent people from using the old function. And make sure that in your linting rule, you say, use this new function, and don't just say like, don't use this function, it's deprecated. That is not a useful error message. Like, first of all,
what do I do instead?
Yeah, but you wouldn't believe the number of people who are just like, oh, I'll just say like, this is deprecated. Like that's not useful. Like, first of all, you're going to get a million questions like every other week because someone's going to run into this and be like, I used to do it this way. Why can't I do it this way anymore? Like, you have room for improvement. I'm not going to say you failed because you didn't really fail. You have room for improvement if you're still getting questions like several months out about like, how do I do this? Like, I don't understand what's going on. Why am I getting a deprecated warning? Why are my tests failing? Yeah. Because you changed some tests in the CI pipeline that make sure that people don't do the old thing anymore.
That's a great rubric. Yeah, that's a great rubric. Like if you're still getting these questions, you're not quite there yet. I think one of the things I love about this book is that expands what we consider a refactoring. You really lay out, I think, more of this process and see it's not just the changing of the code. Again, going back to just happened to be happening by, that is a very small distinct portion, but there's really a lot of different steps all the way through here. And I think that's the value of, I loved this book for that. I want to ask one last question. I would like to go a little bit behind the scenes at Slack. I think like a lot of us were probably curious. I know I am. And in your first year at Slack, you undertook a pretty major refactoring with a group of other people to consolidate two redundant database schemas. It sounds like it was an incredible learning opportunity. What was the biggest thing you learned, or what do you wish you knew before you started that project?
Gosh, I wish I knew a lot of things.
We learn a lot by doing, right?
Oh yeah, definitely. Would have gone much faster. I think the biggest thing I wish I had known was this like idea of like momentum is really great at the start usually, and then just like dies and like falls off a cliff partway through. And it's really tough to recover from that cliff, and sometimes you don't. So one thing that happened with this project is as we started, there were like a bunch of folks helping out, and a lot of the big problem with how we reached this cliff of like, we just like fell off, was everyone on the team who was working with me was like hyper paralyzed. Like we were all working on like all of these other problems at the same time. And because like performance was like a really, really, really big problem. And we all had these like P0 projects. And so I was leading this one P0 with like some help from these other people. And partway through, we got to like maybe the like 70% done phase. And it felt close enough to being done that everyone else who had all these other projects sort of stopped helping. And like, I do not blame for them for this. I probably would have done the same. I'd have been like, oh, this is 70% done. They have it. Like they can take it through the finish line. Like it's fine. But then that 30% takes twice as long as the original 70% because you're left sort of by yourself. And so figuring out how to make sure to build momentum throughout so that you don't get to this cliff. It's a really hard problem, and it's not one that like one solution fixes all of these. Like I tried to persuade people to help me by bringing in brownies. Like that didn't work. I literally a thing I tried.
Love that.
Did not work. Or I like bothered people in DM directly. I was like, hey, like you signed up to convert these 4 call sites. Like, what I bet you can't do them by the end of the day.
Like, how did that go? Was that like
it would work a couple times, and then they like knew I was only DMing them to like trick them into doing this, and it didn't really work. But it worked a couple times. It just like it dies off. The novelty of it dies off after some time.
Yep.
Yeah. And so like, and I was trying to get my manager to like push people to help out a little bit more towards the end. And really that's sort of what did it in the end. But like, I've done so many of these at this point, and it's never the same thing that works. Like sometimes the brownies totally works, or sometimes it's just about setting aside time saying like on Thursdays between 2 and 3 p.m., we just refactor, and we work through, like a lot of refactors have these like sort of long spreadsheets of like, we have to fix this and this, and these are all the instances of X we have to fix, right? And like for 1 hour between 2 and 3 p.m. on Thursdays, these 6 people will be sitting here cutting PRs to convert these things. And that works too sometimes. And sometimes it doesn't work. It really depends on like the kind of people you work with, the team you're working with. Like, is it a tiger team? Is it all these people who are pulled from different teams coming together? Usually those teams don't fall off this momentum cliff as hard as like regular teams who are trying to do regular work in addition to a refactor. That's really the killer in a lot of these cases. And you have to be really mindful of that too. If you're planning something and you're on a team that has all these other priorities in addition to the refactor, like you have to budget 2 or 3x the amount of time to actually get that refactor done, because like stuff is going to keep coming up. And so maybe one of the ways is even just to not try to do other stuff while you're refactoring.
Yeah, or even like what I hear too is like plan for motivation to drop off and
Oh
like
yeah.
understand that that will happen. I mean, I just did a refactoring of my house. I did a get rid of like 465 things, declutter in a month.
Oh wow.
And yeah, I mean, I ended up going with, I almost got 900, but I'm a little bit of an overachiever. But I did feel this like whole momentum drop off. It was after I went through
Yeah.
all of my papers. I was going through a particularly like detailed part of like going through every paper. I had like boxes of them, and my motivation fell off. So there was, anyway, it just reminds me of like a refactoring and a decluttering. There's some things in there. I felt my own motivation, you know,
Oh yeah.
falling off. Like, oh, I got most of the way there, and I was like, oh, I'm exhausted now.
It's different for everyone what that
Yeah,
point is too. It's really interesting.
but to plan for it, I think, is like to understand sort of like psychologically or organizationally also, because other priorities will come in that you didn't expect, like, oh, now we got this new thing that we have to do. So it's like planning for it, so that, because I would imagine like 70%, even though it's nice, it's just not going to cut it. Like
Yeah.
either you left some stuff still out on the counter, or you've got to, somebody's doing it almost alone, which is not
Not great.
not great, not motivationally, and for their own sort of, their own morale and the team's morale and all of that. This has been so fun. I could talk to you forever. So we need to end here. Thank you so much for
Thank
joining us
you.
this session. Maude will be joining us on the Lead Dev Slack, where she'll be taking some questions. And head over to the bookmarked channel where that will be taking place. Our next session will be on March 2nd, where we'll be talking with Liz Wiseman on multipliers. And on April 6th, we'll be talking with Annie Jean Baptiste about building for everyone. Thanks so much, everybody.